At 2:30 p.m. local time over the South China Sea, an American helicopter was carrying out a mission that rattled Beijing's nerves. In response, China dispatched its premier attack helicopter, a Z-10, to confront it. What the Chinese pilot didn't realize was that this routine intimidation run would turn into a disastrous mistake. Over the next 72 minutes, while attempting to unsettle the world's most dominant navy, he would hand the US a treasure trove of intelligence Beijing never intended to give away. The Z-10 had lifted off from Xiamen 28 minutes earlier, tasked with little more than chasing away the Americans. Meanwhile, the US Navy's MH-60 Romeo, a helicopter often described as the Swiss Army knife of naval aviation, was methodically tracking a Chinese Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. That sub had been underwater for 2 straight days and now desperately needed to recharge. Diesel submarines are like holding one's breath. Eventually, you must come up for air, and when you do, US eyes are waiting. Foreign military aircraft, you are approaching Chinese territorial waters. Adjust your course at once. A harsh, metallic voice crackled through the radio. The radio transmission cut in just as the Z-10 swept aggressively across the Romeo's path at 500 meters. Yet there was a glaring problem. They were 50 nautical miles from any Chinese claim, squarely in international skies where the Americans had every right to operate. Inside the Romeo, its 3-person crew, 2 pilots and 1 sensor operator, barely reacted. They knew something the Chinese did not. In trying to intimidate the US, Beijing was about to make a grave miscalculation. The Romeo was far from idle. Those pods and protrusions along its frame, ALQ-210 electronic support measure systems, high-tech sponges vacuuming every electronic signature the Z-10 gave off. Radar emissions, radio protocols, engine resonance, all were cataloged. While the Chinese pilot strutted for intimidation, he didn't realize his helicopter was the subject of a live dissection. The Z-10, built with outdated Russian design help in the 1990s, had the posture of a warbird, but the guts of a hand-me-down. To punctuate his presence, the Chinese pilot popped 2 flares. It wasn't an act of war, but a showy attempt at dominance, more bark than bite. The Americans' response was subtle but devastating. They directed their dipping sonar toward the submarine below, silently reminding Beijing the vessel remained firmly in their sights. Panicked, the Type 039 crash-dived. In doing so, it made catastrophic noise. Cavitation roared from the sudden dive. Hull panels groaned under pressure. The racket was so extreme, sensors across the carrier strike group detected it instantly. In submarine warfare, sound is suicide. The Z-10 pilot trying to defend the sub had effectively doomed it instead, if this had been wartime. Still, the humiliation wasn't over. At 2:48 p.m., after nearly 20 minutes of fruitless showboating, the Z-10 finally achieved what the pilot thought was success. His fire control radar locked onto the Romeo. The shrill tone in his headset suggested he had the upper hand, until 3 seconds later when it all unraveled. Nearby, an EA-18 Growler roared to life. Using its ALQ-99 jamming pods, it unleashed a wall of electromagnetic interference that turned the Z-10's radar picture into chaos. The supposed target multiplied into a dozen phantom contacts, some moving backward, others teleporting across the scope, one impossibly hovering inside his own cockpit. This was the collision of outdated 1990s-era tech with cutting-edge American electronic warfare. The ALQ-99 didn't simply block signals, it bent reality, darting across frequencies quicker than the Chinese system could track. While the Z-10's radar lingered on one band, the jamming had already skipped to dozens more. Then came the real shock. US carrier radars illuminated him. To the Chinese pilot, it was as if a spotlight from nowhere had found him in the dark. Moments later, FA-18 Super Hornets began lifting off, not to engage, but to send an unmistakable reminder. This Romeo was never alone. The full might of the US Pacific Fleet stood behind it. The Chinese pilot scrambled for solutions, switching channels, boosting power, cycling his radar. nothing broke the American grip. The Romeo's electronic suite operated across multiple bands simultaneously, creating what specialists call full-spectrum dominance. The Chinese pilots had another name for it: panic. Inside the American helicopter, the crew was so unfazed they could have been debating dinner. They knew something the Z-10 pilot did not. The longer this dragged on, the more valuable the intelligence haul would be. So they banked slightly, aiming their sonar back at the submarine below. Once again, the vessel made desperate turns, each one producing more noise, each soundbite feeding the Americans more precise tracking data. The Romeo's commander issued a calm radio call. Chinese military aircraft. This is United States Navy aircraft operating in international airspace in accordance with international law. We will maintain course and altitude translation. Nothing you do matters. Every moment was priceless. US systems logged that Chinese encryption protocols hadn't been updated since 2003. Their radar frequencies traced back to designs purchased from Russia decades earlier. Even the rhythm of rotor blades was captured, useful for identifying a Z-10 by sound from 50 miles away. Frustrated, the Chinese pilot closed distance, thinking proximity would solve his woes. At 500 meters, he could clearly see the Romeo's door gunner behind the GAU 21.50 caliber machine gun, unraised, but sending a message all the same. He threw his Z-10 into sharp lunges, feints meant to draw a defensive move. Yet his maneuvers bled speed and pushed the airframe to its limits. The Romeo, derived from the Black Hawk, held superior G-load tolerance. The American crew barely budged while sensors harvested data. Turn rates, climb speeds, everything. The Z-10 was writing its own manual for defeat. The FLIR camera filmed exhaust ports glowing at 450 degrees Celsius, gear housings at 180 degrees Celsius, all perfect aim points for heat-seeking missiles. The imbalance only grew clearer. The Z-10's 23mm cannon was useful against ground targets within 2,500 meters, but against a maneuvering helicopter, almost worthless at 500 meters. Meanwhile, the Romeo's GAU-21 boasted nearly 2,000 meters of effective range, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds that would shred the Z-10's cabin with ease. Warning lights began flooding the Chinese cockpit like a Christmas display. Controls felt sluggish. The airframe strained, yet retreat risked court-martial. Determined, he muted the alarms and pressed on. He attempted radar locks 14 separate times, each a data gift to American analysts who logged every pulse and frequency hop. Trying to burn through jamming was like punching in wrong passwords over and over while the other side wrote them all down. Even his laser designation system betrayed him. The Romeo identified the exact model and its software version, giving the US the ability to jam every other Chinese platform using it. One encounter had compromised an entire weapons generation. Stress bled into performance. The Z-10's engine strained at 105% power, glowing 40% hotter than normal on American sensors. Hydraulic systems flagged, transmissions overheated, and servos lagged. By pushing so hard, the helicopter became its own worst enemy. At 3:42 p.m., more than an hour after it began, the Romeo lowered its sonar again. The submarine was still cornered. After 72 minutes of effort, the Z-10 hadn't budged the Americans even slightly. His finger hovered over the transmit button, but he knew ground control already saw his failure. For the Americans, the operation was pure success. Jamming frequencies mapped, thermal targets logged, maneuver data captured, communications cracked. The US Navy had just secured an encyclopedia of Chinese vulnerabilities from one reckless pilot. The message left behind was unmistakable. Against America's electronic warfare and tactical dominance, Beijing's Z-10 was hopelessly outclassed. The lesson was harsh but clear: stick to consumer knockoffs, because on the battlefield, imitation means defeat.